Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Bird and Stars Podcast 4th season. All my loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. It's an amazing episode because Matt Rowen, Sara Wile, and Xen boards the mothership to discuss Mist, Address Unknown. Now come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Matt, Sara, and Xen. Welcome to the Traversing the Stars Podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. So glad to be here.
It's good to be here on the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Totally my pleasure. So I will start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for comics in this case, and who were your earliest influences?
Oh my gosh.
Oh boy, this would be a tough question for Sara.
Here I am staring over the webcam at my collection of comics on the wall.
Yes, our wall of comics.
I mean, Saga is one of my big comic loves, and I'm sure influenced Midst in many ways. I mean, it's a grand space opera that goes ridiculous places and goes serious places, and if Midst is even a little bit like Saga, then I consider that a win. So that's a big influence for me.
How about Xen and Matt?
Gosh, well, I am not as much of a lifelong comics fan as Sara, but through my association with her, have discovered many comics, including Saga. I love East of West.
I love that one.
The Black Sad series, which I believe is from Dark Horse. Is that correct?
Think so.
Yes. And a lifelong favorite graphic novel of mine is one called Tale of Sand, which is a graphic novelization of an unproduced Jim Henson film script. And it is dreamy and amazing and one of my favorite pieces of print media of all time.
Very cool.
Fabulous. Yeah, for me, I think my very first comic book was a Uncle Scrooge and or DuckTales.
I was hoping you were
Yes, it was definitely in the adventuring duck genre. And I believe I received that when I was probably like 8 years old. I still have it. Love adventuring ducks. But I think as far as inspirations for comics are concerned, oh man, things that I would point to. East of West was definitely on my list. I mean, I'm also a big fan of and the Critical Role comics that have been coming out. The origins for the Mighty Nine are some of my favorites. That was one of my first encounters with the Critical Role outfit. So yeah, it's been a journey, and though Address Unknown is not about adventuring ducks, we are very, very thrilled to have it out and available now.
So what I think is very cool, as we'll go a little more deeper in both the comic book, we also want to touch base on the podcast. Now, someone actually obviously doing podcasts myself, your success with your podcast is amazing. So for those who don't know, your comic book series came out called Mist, Address Unknown, but it's based on a podcast, space western podcast, also known as Mist. So can you kind of give a listener some information about what is Mist? How did this idea of creating kind of a story-based podcast come about, and how does that actually work?
Who wants to take this?
I'll give it a spin. Well, we've all three of us been fans of like old school radio drama for a long time. That was something that we all enjoyed and did some of when we all met years ago. And you know, old school radio drama from American and European history is a rich tradition full of fantastic audio fiction that goes way back to the mid-century. And we are big fans of some of those old-fashioned radio plays. So it was a pretty natural progression for us as we were getting into our own kind of experimental theater stuff and our own love of tabletop role-playing games, which is kind of a theatrical exercise in its own way, that we would take a gaming project that we were working on, originally a tabletop gaming experience called Midst, and convert it into an audio drama podcast, kind of in that classic radio play style, except modernized in some ways, in order to share that story, which originated as a game for the three of us, with a wider audience through that audio drama narrative format.
So the interesting about doing it as a podcast, as the story, once again, we're going to talk about the comic book soon, but there's multiple different benefits of doing a radio drama, but there's also limitations of using a radio drama. So how do you kind of navigate both the strengths and limitations of, in many ways, but it's basically a radio drama?
That's an interesting question. I guess a line we say a lot is that Midsed is a podcast that knows it's a podcast. So even though when we were originally coming up with the world, we didn't necessarily have the audio format in mind, once we committed to that, I think we just leaned into it really hard and tried to take advantage of its strengths. There are things that audio storytelling can do that no other medium can do. And Xen happens to be a very talented sound designer and composer, which is convenient if you're going to be making a podcast, right?
A nice coincidence.
Yeah, it certainly helped out. And I guess one of the ways that we took advantage of the podcast format is playing with the role of the narrator. It's one of the, I guess, unique characteristics of Midsed is that we really make ourselves characters in a way, ourselves as narrators. We're very present. We're not trying, there's no framing device for why you're there or why you're listening. It's not like a series of found footage or anything like that. We're just telling you a story, and we know that you are there as a podcast listener, sitting there listening to us or commuting. I don't presume that you are sitting when you listen.
Yeah, I'll add to that too to say that even from the very beginning, we were very intentional about kind of referring to the show of Midst as being a little bit more than a podcast. It was also supported by a lot of incredible original art that Sara had done. And we also produced some materials that we called the appendices, sort of in-universe ephemera and objects from the world that the characters might interact with to help kind of like flesh out and show other dimensions of that Midst cosmos that we started to kind of assemble. And in the kind of the same way that like graphic novels like Watchmen have some of those like extra pieces, the like under the hood novelization within the story of the characters, we really liked stories that sort of inserted themselves in reality in that way and wanted to help kind of lend to that verisimilitude through things like the appendices. And as we were sort of supporting the story with these add-on pieces, through the connection to Critical Role, the subject of comic books sort of emerged. And that was how we started kind of discussing how and in what ways some other stories could possibly be told, but only in the way that comic books can operate too. So there's always been a very strong awareness of the medium that the Midst story is sort of like coming through. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
So an interesting thing about and having going through this list and learning about your podcast, it's described as being semi-improvised.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing about improvisation is that it can sometimes, it's sort of hard to sometimes wrangle, especially when you have multiple people involved, how to keep it towards your destination that you want to try to hit. I know, allow to have freedom, but veer off too far from your overall story arc and map, you could get lost in it. So how does the improvisation aspect work in the podcast? How much leeway do you actually have when you're doing the show? How much of it is actually from written, prompt, in dialogue, things of that nature?
Well, we're very flexible with our rules for ourselves. I like to say that improv is the tool, not the product. We don't really go out of our way to bill Midst as an improv podcast because that's not really the genre that it is. There's like a different genre. There's a different set of podcasts out there that are improv, where the improv is more central, like watching a group of actors pull something together live with no planning. Whereas Midst has a lot of planning that goes into it. We just happen to not use a script a lot of the time.
So when you're plotting out the podcast, we'll get to the comic book in a moment. When you plot out the podcast, how far in advance is the storyline already mapped? When you, for instance, your previous episode, how you already know the destination you're eventually going to get to and you're circling it? Or is this wide open and infinite and this could go on months, years, decades?
Well, in the case of the original podcast of Mids, which is now complete, all 3 seasons of that podcast are concluded and available now for listening enjoyment. That was all pre-planned in advance in the sense that we knew what our trajectory was, we knew what our goal was, and we knew how many episodes we had. And we improvised and lightly planned and prepared and outlined our way to achieve that goal in the time, the amount of time, the number of episodes we had set out for ourselves. So we have extensively planned and outlined Mids in the sense that we know what every single episode needs to achieve, but exactly the dialogue that is delivered or how and where the characters move or how they perform was, for the most part, almost entirely unscripted most of the time, as well as the narration in the podcast. Generally, our goal as we produced Mids was to hit certain plot beats in every episode, such as the episode in which this guy goes to this location or this information is revealed, but exactly how and in what ways or by whom or what they say or when they say it is up to the improvisation. Sort of like running and playing a game where you're all around a table just kind of essentially improvising as you go. Though, a game master might have some plan about what they generally want to achieve in a session. We were kind of the same way with Midst.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure the question that any podcaster on my end of things would love to know. Once again, Midst and as being especially part of also Critical Role, is super successful. I think the channel you have has like over 2 million subscribers at the moment, which I'm envious of quite a bit. How difficult was the promotion side, and what advice can you give to the other podcasters, such as myself, who's trying to break through the way you guys did?
That's a great question. And I mean, honestly, at the time that we were discovered by Critical Role, we were not focusing super heavily on promotion. So I feel like there's always an element of luck and randomness in any success story, right? And that's frustrating to hear because it's the thing we can't control and prepare for. But I guess we just focused our energy on putting as much passion into the project as we could and really trying to make it the best that it could be. So though our viewership was quite small for a long time, I think we're very fortunate in that it was composed pretty much all of super dedicated fans. So small but mighty.
So now that you owned the world of podcasting, you're moving into the realm of comic books. So when you're thinking about Midst, Address Unknown, what things were you considering that this is something that the comic book can do or needs to do that we couldn't do with our podcast show?
Well,
so many things.
The audio podcast format is primarily us talking constantly.
That's all a podcast is.
Just talking and talking and talking and talking and talking.
Incessantly.
In the famous words of somebody, a picture is worth 1,000 of those words. So a comic book can instantaneously visually explain something that would take us 5 minutes to verbally describe.
You can just show a picture of it.
Yeah. So we're
revolutionary.
In Midst, the audio drama, we have to laboriously, give a huge speech about, the strange physics of our cosmos or the weird way in which the world of Midst, a spherical planetoid, rotates in a cosmic ocean of darkness. And the listener's probably like, I don't understand. I have no idea what that means.
Yeah.
In a comic book, open the page, there it is. You're like, oh, great.
Got it.
I understand immediately. So that was a huge benefit and wonderful mechanism to use in comics. Just show it, draw it.
I don't know if this is working to our advantage or against us, but our world it's pretty weird. Like there's no sun, gravity works in all kinds of strange ways. It's for the first several episodes of season 1, we don't really explain the layout of the universe. There's a lot of very confusing things going on, but in the first few pages of the comic, Address Unknown, it's just blam, kind of there. It lays it all out for you right away, and all without us having to explain. what is going on.
Yeah, we've had previous listeners of Midst who were originally familiar with the audio podcast who've gone on now to read the comic, and we've seen multiple people just exclaiming that, like, oh, I listened to this entire drama and I think I understood what was going on. I looked at literally the first page of this comic and instantly
Snapped into place.
Comprehended a huge magnitude of things that were, a little harder to grasp when you're just listening to an audio format. So comics are incredible in that way.
So when you think about Address Unknown, how interconnected is it with the podcast? Does it exist as a furthering of the storyline? Is it a sharing of the storyline based on, now that it's a comic book form? Is it something totally unique from what you were doing on the show?
Well, we tried to make each new Midst thing a equally valid entry point into the world. So it's technically a prequel in that the events of the comic happened before the events of the podcast, but we tried to ensure that you could approach them in either order and it would be fine either way.
What my understanding is that while you guys created the comic book, it's being written by Colin Lorimer. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yes.
So when you're looking for a comic book writer, you have three very unique voices on your podcast, a whole host of interesting characters. How hard was it to find a writer that can match the voices of all three of you or the characters you're developing?
Well, thankfully, Dark Horse knows what they're doing, even if we're totally new to comics.
That's true. They have fantastic. I mean, a big part of why we worked with these particular writers was that Dark Horse knew the right connections, and they were well familiar with writers who had the right skill set to bring this kind of storytelling to life. I mean, part of it was us also just speaking to and interviewing some writers, just chatting with them to determine if it was a good fit and if we liked their style and their vibe and their storytelling voice. But Dark Horse brought them to our attention as a suggestion. We chatted with them, and pretty much right out of the gate, it was a pretty clear and obvious choice that Dark Horse had recommended the right people.
Yeah, like we had an outline, we had a kind of vibe for the comic, and Dark Horse, like Xen said, rounded up some suggestions based on that, and we just went from there. So we didn't have to go from square one, just wander out into the world searching for writers. Luckily, we were very fortunate to kind of have options brought to us.
So when you talk to Mr. I'm saying the name wrong, please correct me, Lorimer.
I believe that's correct.
Were there parameters set in place for him for what he could do or not do with this story or with his characters? Or let's say other guidelines such as your characters cannot interfere with this part of the show that we've done as well. And how difficult was it to then have him exist within a defined framework?
I can take that question. It was really actually very seamless, I would say. From the jump when we were embarking on kind of the Midst enterprise, we've always looked at it as sort of this like sandbox where we're all kind of coming to it. We're bringing, weird and quirky ideas that we have about storytelling to that sandbox and playing with those ideas together. And when we got to work with Colin for the first of the three comics, Address Unknown, it was extremely rad to be able to sit down in a Zoom call, not unlike this, and sort of go through a little bit of a loose concept, some characters that we thought would be a cool focus for the story, a little bit of a background of the islet of Midst itself, the setting of that particular issue, and to hear from him the things that were really, really exciting for Colin to work on as far as monster design, or he really does horror very well. So there is some kind of delicious, spooky, suspenseful pages in that comic that just make for some really, really fun and engaging repartee between the characters that I felt very much exemplified kind of that same bantering conversational tone that Midst and the narrators possess.
Mm-hmm. And I have something to add on. With all of these comics, we made the decision to center them around characters that were not really central to the podcast, exactly for this reason, so that there wouldn't be so much like micromanaging and fact checking to do of, oh, this character wouldn't say that, or this character was doing something else at this point in their timeline. They were kind of fresh characters that the writers could have a bit more creative control over and really make the story their own.
Now, an interesting part in the comic book that appears, and maybe you can help define it for me, maybe a little bit more thoroughly, is the idea of the fold. Now, can you kind of orient us on what the fold and the nature of it is within our comic book world?
Yeah. So the fold, I guess the easiest analogy for it is just to imagine the ocean. Imagine that the sky and the ocean comprises an entire cosmos, a universe. But instead of water, the ocean is a dark, supernatural, fog-like substance composed of millions or trillions, a very large number of little microorganisms that react to light. And they can react to light in basically any way, creating basically any effect. These effects are called terrors, and it's basically a blank check for any wacky, surreal thing to happen.
Yeah, the Mids cosmos is a divided one. Half of the entire universe in the Mids storyverse is this, realm of light and clouds, and the other half is this deep, perhaps infinite, who knows, sea of fog-like darkness. And it is in that fog, known as the Fold, that so many strange and surreal and unusual supernatural kind of things can happen. And in a comic book setting, working with Colin Lorimer on Address Unknown, getting to inform Colin that, oh yes, anything can happen, and seeing his eyes kind of go wide in our first meeting. What do you mean anything? You really mean anything? To which we would say, yes, Colin, anything. And him just sort of rubbing his hands together in devious glee as he realized, like, oh, I can really do all kinds of crazy stuff with this comic. Very fun format for comic writer to just say, to tell them, like, yeah, half of our universe is full of limitless possibility. Yeah. And
weird magic soup.
Go nuts.
And
so that's great for a comic experience.
Because midst the location, the islet, which is what we call planets in our cosmos, is positioned right on the border between these two halves of the cosmos. You get to experience both, which is really fun in a comic format. And big shout out to the colorist, Chris O'Halloran, who, the two color palettes that you see in Address Unknown as it switches between the which is what is not the Fold, and the Fold is just like so fun to see that contrast. One is very bright and white and dazzling with lots of those like orangey Western colors, and then you get to the Fold pages, which are purple, and there's hot pink in there, and it's just very lurid in a way I enjoy.
Is there a danger in leaving the door that wide open for you? Where like literally anything you can do? Was there a part of you that thought maybe we need to rein him in just a little bit before he goes too crazy?
Well, yes, and we did have to put, guardrails up if we saw something at the script stage or the pencil stage where we're like, well, that has to be a different way.
Sorry.
X, Y, or Z canon reason.
Yeah, there were a couple situations where something was written or something was illustrated that was sort of, frankly, kind of too absolutely insane. And in a couple cases, we had to kind of scale it back and say, well, like, yes, technically anything could happen, and that is possible, but for the parameters of this particular comic and the kind of story that we're trying to tell here, we're not certain we want to go quite this far with the total and absolute limitless insanity. So yeah, we did shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit with that, but it was a great balancing act, and we found some very good middle ground.
Yeah, boy, I really don't like having to tell an artist or a writer like that something needs to be changed just because it wouldn't fit in our cosmos, because 9 times out of 10 they're just absolutely rad ideas.
Yeah, and it would fit in our cosmos, but for the parameters of this particular narrative, realizing like, well, actually for story reasons, we have to make this a little less bonkers.
Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the highlights of the comic book that I was able to read is the dialogue. There's a lot of good interplay, especially between Ogden and Rowan. Am I saying that pronouncing correctly?
Right.
Ogden and Rowan has great dialogue. Now, obviously, my thought is the importance of the dialogue because it is from a podcast that's spoken, and now you already have the same feel of the comic book as you do in the podcast, or it just happened to fall upon great dialogue interplay.
All credit goes to Colin there.
Yeah.
We didn't want to set down any rules that like they had to mimic the voice of the podcast or anything like that.
Right.
But I think he was really able to capture that kind of bickering sibling energy that the two of them have really, really well.
Yeah, I think we were just very lucky to work with Colin. We do have a preference working in audio podcasting as we do, that we do like dialogue and we enjoy playing and performing and improvising, funny and weird characterful conversations between characters, and that Colin had the natural skill that he had to give everyone a unique voice and such fun, twisty dialogue in his own way, I think just speaks to the excellence of that particular pairing and his personal skill and knack as a writer, which is considerable.
And the comic book has a pretty big cast. Let's go through some of the characters. You have Ogden and Rowan. Joe, am I saying it correctly?
Joe.
It's
Joe.
Joe, but you can't be faulted because it is spelled with a G.
There's Meredith Nelson, Sam Nelson, B and Ball, Howie Flakes, Merv Peak. That's a huge cast. So how difficult was it to have a sort of that many characters to make sure each one is unique and equally interesting? Obviously, you can't have characters. Every character you have does have to have a purpose. You can't have one just dominate everything. We're gonna have of that cast. So can you talk me through the importance of that cast and how you kept each one interesting, unique, and how you brought it over to Mr. Lorimer?
Well, again, I think a lot of the credit goes directly to Mr. Lorimer in this case. I think the only characters we really handed to him that we said that had to be in the story were Ogden and Rowan Shearwater and Joe. And beyond that, we kind of had more vague parameters, like a group of people from the fold that he meets. And he came back with this incredible cast of very distinctive.
Iconic. Yeah.
I forget if you mentioned Howie, the dance instructor / babysitter who looks like he comes from a Tim Burton movie. I love him.
So having read, had this comic book out, Address Unknown, is it tempting to now go through your podcast and now make even more characters and even more comic books and just go absolutely now crazy now that you have now built a media empire on some level?
There is some temptation there. It does go both ways. I mean, the podcast and the characters in the audio drama have informed some of the characters who appear in the comics. And I can't divulge too many details, but it might also go the other way at times. There's a non-zero chance that the characters in the comics may have something to do with the audio format at times.
I'll say it's impossible not to be inspired in turn when you open your universe up to other creators and see what they make.
And as talking about inspiration, as being comic book fans, is there then the temptation to write now the comic books yourselves, being that it's the comic books are now out there and now you have the opportunity to do technically your own writing?
The thought had occurred to us. we are pretty busy creating mids in our own ways.
Yeah.
But had we more time and some flexibility, that certainly there's not a lack of interest in that possibility.
I mean, frankly, I'll say this: the other comic books as well. We have issue 2 titled The Valorous Farmer coming out on September the 11th, and Ripples emerges, I believe, this December. Each of those issues is constructed out of a completely unique set of writer, illustrator, colorist. It's a spectacular series, I think, of different stories with different perspectives of different moments in different places throughout the Midst cosmos, and sort of the same way that through the podcast we get to explore all of these different characters in the ways that we like to at such great lengths and depths. I find so much of the joy and the beauty of the comics to be from what the other creative teams brought to them, the different ways that, yes, like the characters that Colin wrote emerge on the page, but there are some delightful things that Kendra and the other writers will be
Jasmine, yeah.
Yes, yeah, that you'll see in the future issues that I think also give that fun new alternate type of perspective. So I don't know. I kind of like that it's its own thing. It is being the way that it is and being explored by these folks.
I would also add that while the temptation to write or illustrate these comics ourselves might be there, like just because we created the world, that's a very different expertise than knowing how to do comics. Comics people are fearsomely talented. Like, it is a very specialized skill set, whether you are a writer or an illustrator or a letterer, every part of the process. Like, these are experts. So it might be interesting someday to explore that, but I don't presume to think that I like currently have the chops to do that. So maybe if I work hard someday, there'll be a comic that I don't know if I'd rather write or illustrate. But...
Well, either way, it is a very fun treat for us not writing them, in the sense that, as Matt was describing, we get to sit back and sort of experience a new Midst story ourselves, one that we did not solely fabricate on our own, and to have it created and then published, and then we get to page through it. It's almost like I'm being told a Midst story now for the first time by someone else, and that is maybe more fun than if I just wrote it myself and then patted myself on the back for it.
So the first issue, Address Unknown, is out. When can we expect the next 2 issues to come out, and then what's next for the Midst team?
So Valorous Farmer comes out on September 11th, which, depending on when this video comes out, is either very soon or just happened, but it's right around the time of now. And as Matt mentioned, the third one, Ripples, comes out in December. And as for what's coming next, I don't think currently we're able to really talk about that, but I promise that it won't be too long before.
In the podcast, we voice the characters of the narrators, who are, this is very important, unreliable. So you should be
50.
There are some things we can say and some things we cannot.
Well, one thing we can say, which is that outside of the audio drama of Midst and outside of these comics, which we've been discussing today, there is another Midst story that is now available, and that is the narrative role-playing experience called Moonward, which is a tabletop role-playing game of sorts that is a Midst story that is now complete and available, which we played at the Critical Role Studios with some of the cast of Critical Role. That was a tabletop role-playing game adjacent dramatic narrative experience with 4 episodes with Sarah and Matt and myself playing a game with Liam O'Brien and Marisha Ray of Critical Role.
You're underselling yourself. You ran it.
I was the game master, known as the guide narrator of Moonward. But that is an original Midst story as well, in a completely different format from comic or audio drama. It is a role-playing game with full video and live sound and live music and lots of cool effects. And that is another Midst story that is available now and is quite fun.
Oh, and I guess we should also shout out for subscribers on mids.co and through Critical Role's newish platform, Beacon. We also do a monthly show called Midst Messages, where we answer listener questions and talk about behind the scenes stuff and that kind of thing.
Very cool. And when you're ready to talk about the comic launching in December, please come on by. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you
so much for having us.
No problem. Have a great night.
You too.